Susan mentioned some of the things that we're going to talk about today, so I'm going to go over new legislation. She's going to give some American Rescue Plan Act updates, and then our question and answers can come after that. So there were several interesting bills that passed this session, but today I just want to mention a few that will relate to our audits or things that we're maybe going to look for in an audit. And the first one relates to cybersecurity. Unfortunately, cybersecurity incidents are way too frequent anymore. I just spoke to someone the other day, well, Monday this week, who had an incident where they received an email that seemed like it was from one of their employees asking that their direct deposit settings be changed to a new bank account, and that was done. And then, of course, the email wasn't from the employee, and when the employee didn't get their paycheck, that was how it came to light that that had been a fraudulent email. So it's still happening. I know even with the pandemic, even as we're coming out of it, there are still some things that, just like this meeting, that are done electronically. And so just keep in mind any emails that you're not sure about, verify them, contact the person that's sending them by phone, or if they're down the hall, get up and go talk to them, especially if they send something like requesting that you change an email or change a direct deposit, or requesting that you send out payment because there's an invoice that's due and has to be paid right away. Just some of the things that we've kind of talked about in the past. But getting back to House Enrolled Act 1169, the State Office of Technology is now going to be a repository for cybersecurity incidents. And those include ransomware, a compromise of business email, like I just mentioned, or any other incidents that are identified in statute, as well as any other attack that is defined and placed on the Office of Technology's website. And when we refer to the IoT, that's the Indiana Office of Technology. So cities and towns need to keep a couple of things in mind. First, report any cybersecurity incidents quickly. Statute wording says without unreasonable delay, and it also says not later than 2 days after the discovery. And it's 2 business days. So if something happens over a weekend, you want to do it within 2 business days, but obviously as quickly as you can, report those to the Indiana Office of Technology so they can be aware of that, and maybe they're going to look. I'm not sure what they're going to do with that information, but you are required now by statute to report that to them. The second thing to remember is all cities and towns are going to need to provide the Office of Technology with the contact information of the person at your city or town who's going to act as the primary reporter of incidents. That could be a treasurer, a town manager, council president. You'll need to decide who that primary person is going to be and report that to IoT by September the 1st of this year. And then you're going to have to renew that, or every September 1st going forward, you're going to have to report who that person is going to be. At this time, there isn't any specific information from IoT on how the reporting is going to be done, or how you will even provide the contact information. Like when September comes, who are you going to send that to? They haven't worked all of those out yet, those kinks, and set up those systems yet. But they will be having a mechanism for you to do that. And as soon as we know something about that, we'll obviously pass that information along. It may be the AIM or the League of Clerks and Treasurers gets that information as well. So between all of those entities, we'll make sure that you know who you're supposed to report to, either incidents or the primary reporter, before you're letting them know. But just for now, we wanted you to be aware of those reporting requirements and get you thinking about who will be the primary reporter of incidents that happen at your city or town. The new law also provides that if you request it of the Office of Technology, they will develop a list of third-party technology providers that they work with and give that to you. Indiana Code 4-13.1-2-8A already authorizes IoT, if requested by a political subdivision like a city or town, to assist in coordinating information technology systems. They also provide consulting and technical advisory services. They review IT project plans and expenditures, and they can help develop and maintain policies, procedures, and guidelines for the effective use of information technology and interactions between your unit of government and state agencies. So now add to that list, they're going to develop third-party vendors, and that's being added effective July the 1st. And don't forget, you are still required to report any material losses to the State Board of Accounts. So if your city or town is a victim of cybersecurity, some fraudulent act there, and a material amount of money is lost, let us know in accordance with IC 511-127. You're to do that in writing. You can email us. You can call us too, but probably follow that up with the email. But we need to know that information by statute. House and Order Act 1271 was the DLGF bill this year. It's a really lengthy bill, and I didn't want to go into a lot of detail of it here in this meeting just because of the volume, and you may hear more from DLGF about the other things in it. The biggest takeaway for cities and towns, I think, is regarding the amount that you can transfer to your rainy day fund for the next 4 years, including this year. So now and until the end of 2024, the maximum amount you can transfer to rainy day is increasing from 10% to 15%. So the wording in the statute, which is Indiana Code 36-185.1, now provides that you can transfer up to 15% of your total annual budget to your rainy day fund. And as before, this excludes any debt service funds. You can't transfer those. So hopefully that'll be a benefit to units for the next few years until we get to 2024. That's the end of when the ARP money has to be used, and hopefully we'll be through all the financial aspects of the pandemic by then. Next up is House Enrolled Act 1437. COVID and the pandemic forced nearly all of us to learn how to work remotely last year and how to conduct public meetings electronically. So keep in mind, technically, we're still in a state of emergency right now. On May the 28th, this is a couple of weeks ago, Governor Holcomb renewed for the 15th time his executive order declaring a public health emergency still exists. That isn't set to expire until July the 1st, and it could be extended at that time. So the provisions in Executive Order 20-04 regarding public meetings and being held electronically are still in effect as of today. But eventually the executive order is going to be lifted by the governor, and then when that happens, there will still be the opportunity to hold public hearings and meetings electronically within certain parameters due to this newly elected legislation. So I want to touch on some of those now. The new legislation provides for meetings in times of a state or local disaster. It provides for rules for meeting when there is no emergency. And also, what came through this bill was the ability for your boards or governing bodies to sign bonds electronically. The statute specifically states now that the electronic signature on bonds that you're issuing have the same force and effect as a manual signature. So when a state or local disaster has been declared, either by the governor in the case of the state or a governing body in the case of a local disaster, a physical meeting is not required, but your board can meet by any means of electronic communication if at least a quorum exists either in person or via the electronic communication, and if the public can also attend and observe at the same time. Now, previously, the statutes haven't gone into specifics as to what needs to be in meeting minutes, but that's changing a little bit for these electronic meetings. In declared emergencies, minutes need to have information on the members that are present in person or electronically, the members that are absent, the identification of the electronic means. So if it's by Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams or Skype or however you're doing that, you need to note that in the minutes. And that, again, that method should allow the governing body and the public to participate and observe. All votes taken during the meeting must be by roll call vote. And finally, it's our audit position that meeting minutes may be signed electronically if the governing body has a written policy permitting that. We've had lots of questions during the last year and a half about having these meetings and getting them signed and when they're signed and how that all takes place. And you can have electronic signatures on those documents on your meeting minutes if your board has adopted a policy to permit that. Now, during times when there is not a state or local emergency, electronic meetings will be permitted if it allows members to simultaneously communicate with each other and it allows the public to attend and observe. There shall be an adopted written policy of the governing body establishing the procedures that apply to a member's electronic participation. And that policy can be more restrictive than what the statute calls for. For reasons of determining a quorum, a member who's attending electronically is considered present. And when it comes to final actions, a member can only participate if they can be seen and heard. So that final vote on something, if a member is participating electronically, you have to be able to hear their yay or nay, and you'll be able to see them. Again, with these electronic meetings in times of non-emergencies, some of what is required in your minutes is changing a little bit. So now what's required is, even in non-emergencies, you have to identify those that are present in person and those that are participating electronically. You have to indicate which members are absent altogether. Again, you need to identify the means of electronic communication. So just like when you're having an electronic meeting during an emergency, even in a non-emergency, you have to state that the meeting's occurring electronically and it's by Zoom or Skype or WebEx, whatever. And there needs to be a notation in your minutes that the public attended and observed electronically. Our audit position is meeting minutes can be signed electronically, but again, the governing body needs to adopt a written policy concerning this, and then they also would obviously need to comply with it. As in times of emergency, during electronic non-emergency meetings, all votes must be by roll call vote. And regarding attendance during non-emergency times, half of the governing body must be in person or physically present. And a member can't attend more than half of the meetings in a calendar year electronically, unless due to certain situations that are listed in the statute, like they're unavailable due to being in military service, or they had a death in the family, or death of a relative is actually what the statute says. Doesn't really define what a relative is there, but a death in the family is impeding with their participation. Or if there's an emergency involving an actual or threatened injury to persons or property. Are there instances when a member cannot participate in an electronic meeting during times of non-emergencies? Well, yes, there are. If there is a final action to adopt a budget, make a reduction in personnel, initiate a referendum, establish or increase a fee, increase a penalty, use the governing body's eminent domain authority, or establish a tax, raise a tax, or renew a tax, then that member has to be in person. The last three things for electronic meetings when no emergency has been declared. A member can't be prohibited from attending consecutive meetings electronically. So that policy that I mentioned a couple of slides back, that can't prohibit someone from attending electronically. A member can attend 2 consecutive meetings electronically. And for the purposes of the statute, they define 2 consecutive meetings. That term, they refer to that as a set of meetings. So 2 consecutive electronic meetings is a set of meetings. And a member has to attend in person at least 1 meeting between sets of meetings in which they participated electronically, unless it's due to situations listed in the statute. Those are the same as I mentioned on the slide before about being in the military or illnesses or deaths in the family. So for example, if your city or town has monthly council meetings and I was a member of your council, I could attend January and February's electronically, so that would mean a set, that's 2 meetings, but then I would have to attend in person in March. And then I could go back to April and May's meetings, I could participate in electronically, and then June's I would have to be physically there. So I could not attend January, February, and March, and April and May all electronically, and then be there the second half of the year. Maybe they have to keep in mind these sets of meetings and being physically present in between sets of meetings. Okay, different subject. Senate Enrolled Act 332 is publishing your notices. So a city or town that is required under Indiana Code 5-3-1 to publish notice in a newspaper 2 or more times may make that first publication of notice in a newspaper as required by 5-3-1-4, so it's very similar to before, and all subsequent publications of that notice are to be made in accordance with 5-3-5 and can be on the official website of the political subdivision, if you have one. If you're required to publish in 2 newspapers at the same time and publish, that event twice, you'll need to advertise for the first time in both newspapers to meet the requirements for that first publication. Any required notices put on your website have to be easily accessible and identifiable. So you can't, bury that somewhere on a remote or obscure, part of your website. It needs to be easily identifiable and accessible by the public. Also has to be on your website for at least 7 days after the last date that's required by statute. So if your statute for your notice requires it be a publication for so long of a length of time, you have to leave it 7 days past that on your website. So you're going to need to come up with some procedures and implement them to be able to document the dates that you put something on a website and when it can come off, those types of things. As used in the new code, official website, or that term official website, means the internet location designated by a city or town as its primary source of information about the city or town on the internet. If you post a notice on your website, a printed copy needs to exist and include the date of the first publication on the website, and you need to retain that for archival and verification purposes. So I think as we go to this electronic notice giving, putting things on the website, that might be something that can be overlooked, that you need to print a copy and keep that either for our audit questions or procedures, or if somebody else, a member of the public or something else might want to see that DLGF, maybe needs to see that you publish something, you'll need to retain a printed copy for your archival materials. Proof of publication needs to be available if anyone requests it. The proof of publication of an electronically published notice is satisfied and considered conclusive upon the provision of the proof is executed by the official designated as responsible for the electronic publications. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, who's responsible for that, and stating that the notice was posted from the initial date through the last posting date that's required by law. As I just mentioned, an official of your city or town needs to be designated as responsible for all electronic publications. It's kind of like that, the notice of the cybersecurity things that I talked about initially. This law, 332, this statute is going to require that someone be designated as responsible for publishing these electronic notices to your website. So again, that can be a clerk treasurer, town manager, maybe you have an IT guy, somebody at your unit's going to have to be responsible for that. And that person's name and contact information is also to be posted on the website so that anyone can find out who that is. The final bill that I'm going to talk about is Senate Enrolled Act 396. It amends the definition of a first-class patrolman and firefighter. The maximum age also for a police department applicant is now, by statute, quote, less than 40, or in everyday terms, 39. So that used to be 35 was the maximum for someone to apply to a police department, and now it's 39. So 39 is the new 35, apparently. This statute or this act also requires employers to provide reports or records that are requested by the system board. And when they refer to the system board, they're talking about IMPERS. And it permits the system board to fine the employer for each day that reports or records are late. And that fine can be up to $100 a day. So if IMPERS is requesting some information from you for the 77 pension and disability fund, so for your police and fire that are in that fund, get them that information as soon as you can, because they can fine you if it's late. Reports and records are due 30 days after the end of the calendar quarter, or an alternate date if IMPERS establishes one. And these reports now by statute are going to be electronically submitted to IMPERS at their direction. So they're going to set up a method for you to do that, some secure method, because some of the information, it wouldn't be anything that you'd want to get out there. But be looking for IMPERS to notify you of how that's going to work, how those reports are going to be transmitted, but the statute does require it to be electronically now. It also requires employers to submit both annually and at the request of IMPERS the salary of a first-class patrolman or firefighter. And this act became effective when it was passed, which was back in April. So if you want to read the entire bill, because it does cover several different statutes, you can use the link that's on the slide to see that actual bill. And speaking of viewing entire bills in their entirety, all of the ones that we've talked about today, all of the ones that were passed during the session are available on the IGA website, the iga.in.gov. And in the upper right-hand corner of the homepage, you click on the tab that says Bills, and then just enter the House Enrolled Act or the Senate Enrolled Act number. And when you do that, it will pull up a screen that looks like this. And on the left-hand side, you can see there's a circle around the latest version. If you click on that, it will give you a PDF of the entire bill that you can read. So with that, are there any questions?
So what I wanted to do now is go through a few ARPA updates for you, just new information. And then, yeah. I just wanted to put some sources of information up for you. I know that we all have a lot of questions on how the ARPA is supposed to work, and there's lots of sources of information out there for you. The U.S. Treasury has on their website the actual act itself, along with the interim final rule and frequently asked questions. And the frequently asked questions that they have are updated on a weekly basis. So you'll want to keep visiting there to look at the new frequently asked questions for the week. Also, Board of Accounts has information on our website for you related to the American Rescue Plan Act. I know AIM has information on there, and the National League of Cities. So there's lots of information out there for you to be able to look at that information and go ahead and make your decisions on that. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. And then on the next slide, I have information on key documents with compliance requirements that our field examiners are going to be looking at and as they come in and do an audit of the ARPA funds. The first one, of course, is going to be that Section 603 of the Act, and we've talked quite a bit about that. It has the 4 categories of expenditures that you can make. Also, the interim final rule, which is published on the U.S. Treasury's website. And that rule has a lot of detailed explanation of about those 4 categories that you can look at if you have any questions, for example, on what it means to respond to the public health emergency. You can go to the interim final rule, and they have examples in there, lists of items that would work in that category. But it's not an exhaustive list. You can add to it, but it would give you an idea of the types of things you can spend that money on. And then also Treasury frequently asked questions. Again, that's a great resource, and they do update those, or they have been at least, on a weekly basis. State Board of Accounts Uniform Compliance Guidelines, of course, will still be important. We have the State Examiner Directive 2021-1 regarding the ARP fund and the accounting processes for the ARP money. That was issued on May 12th of 2021. We also have our City and Town manual and bulletins, just with general uniform compliance guidelines that apply to all funds that you have. And then we have our internal controls manual. Internal controls are very important for all of your funds, and it will be important that you have internal controls for your ARPA money as well. Also on the federal side, if you need a federal audit because you've expended more than $750,000 in federal funds, then you will need to be reviewing the uniform guidance and those testing requirements, which we will probably go over at another time. And then, of course, your local plan that you are going to prepare, if you haven't already, on the uses for the fund in your community. On the next slide, we have what we're looking for in an audit. Again, we're going to be looking for accounting for costs incurred in the ARP fund. They should not be accounted for in any other fund, only the ARP fund. We're going to look for written internal control procedures that would include the ARP money and evidence that those procedures are being followed. We'll also look for documentation of your costs incurred, an explanation of costs incurred per Section 603, the interim final rule and other Treasury guidance. Some examples of that would be explanations or assessments in board minutes, attorney opinions, and just general notes that you would keep for the audit file. And then again, we're going to be looking for the uniform guidance requirements if you've expended greater than $750,000. So we're going to talk about each one of those areas a little bit more specifically now on these next few slides. Hopefully you have all heard all of the information on this slide, but I just wanted to review it one more time because it is the subject of the state examiner's directive and memorandum that went out to you. And these are very important items that our field examiners are going to be looking for during the audit. You should have the ARP money in a separate fund, and the fund name is going to be ARP with the name of the grant, which is the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Your fund number range will be 176 to 199, however that fits into your system. This fund should be established by ordinance, and the ordinance should specify the uses in accordance with Section 603 that are applicable for your unit. And then the ordinance is also going to reference a plan, a local plan that is going to provide more detail on the use of the funds. As far as the transactions are concerned, the money does need to be appropriated by council before it's used. Disbursements do need to be made directly out of the ARP fund through the normal claims process, and you'll need adequate supporting documentation. Disbursements need to comply with the ARPA and the interim final rule, and then finally money cannot be transferred to another fund. So these are all at the direction of the state examiner on how you should account for the ARPA money. And when it comes to internal controls, your internal controls should be written just like always, and there should be some evidence that the internal control procedures have been performed. This is nothing new, and we've talked about these 5 components many times together, and so I think you all have a good idea of what those are. You don't need to have a separate set of internal control procedures for the ARPA money, although you can, but definitely you may need to make some adjustments to your internal controls for the ARPA money, especially in the area of control activities, because depending on how you're going to be using the ARPA money is going to depend on what control activities you have in place. For example, if you're going to use the money to give grants to businesses, that would be one set of control activities to make sure that those agreements are in place, and you've been accounting for that properly. It would be a different set of control activities if you're going to offer your eligible employees premium pay. So you do want to make sure that you have the internal controls in place for the uses of those funds. On the next slide, our field examiners are going to be looking for the supporting documentation. As always, we always look for supporting documentation. You can never have too much information for our field examiners. I'm sure you know that. You would need a detailed invoice or contract, like always, for your disbursements. And also, the interim final rule has some extra requirements that you're going to need to have available, and those would be in the for the assessments that are required. For example, and I'll talk about these on another slide, but as an example, how a cost that you've incurred responds to the COVID-19 public health emergency. That would be in that first category. And there are some assessments that the interim final rule talks about that you would need to make, and you would need to keep those assessments on file for audit. And you'd either want to keep those, with your board minutes, or maybe they're talked about in the board minutes. Maybe you have a written legal opinion from the city or town attorney, or maybe you just have notes in your file for audit. But our field examiners are going to need to see that so that they can check for that. Now, I've talked a lot about the Board of Accounts expectations so far, and I also wanted to mention to you the U.S. Treasury Expectations. And this is what they have said in their frequently asked questions. To ensure public trust, the Treasury expects all recipients to serve as strong stewards of these funds. This includes ensuring funds are used for the intended purposes, and recipients have in place effective financial management, internal controls, and reporting for transparency and accountability. And so we're here to try and help with that, and that is the basis for all of the directives, the directions of the state examiner in regard to, having a separate fund and having an ordinance and having a local plan and making sure the money is appropriated and not being able to transfer money. all of it boils down to the Treasury is expecting effective financial management, internal controls, and reporting. So that's what all of this points to. So if you have questions as you go along, please always feel free to contact us related to that. And then on the next slide, I have uniform compliance guideline requirements. We will go over these hopefully at a separate webinar because it would take a while to go through all of them. But again, just wanted to keep that before you. If you are going to be expending more than $750,000 in federal funds, then these requirements will be tested as well. On the next slide, we have the CFDA number for this grant now. So you can keep that for your records. You'll need that, of course, when you fill out the grant schedule in the annual financial report. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to do maybe a bit of a review on the ARPA and your local plan. And just wanted to remind everybody that this is a long-term program. So, everybody should, just try and take a breath and really go over the things that need to happen before you start spending this money, because it's a good idea to lay a good foundation, again, with your plan, with your internal controls and with your processes that are going to be in place so that you can, when the money is available for spending, then you'll be able to do that and do it wisely. So the first area, of course, is cost to incur to respond to the public health emergency or its negative economic impact. So there's really two different things here in this first category. Responding to the public health emergency, the interim final rule goes into great detail as to what that might include. It would include things like vaccination programs or communication, addressing health disparities, and a whole host of other things that are discussed in the interim final rule. Or you can also respond to negative economic impacts by including assistance to households or small businesses and not-for-profits, or aid to certain industries. So one of the biggest challenges with this section, I think, is the assessment process, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But you're going to need to document how the costs that you're incurring do respond to the public health emergency and create and have a causal connection to the COVID-19 emergency. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on another slide. The second category is funds that can be used for costs incurred to respond to workers performing essential work during the public health emergency, by providing premium pay or providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers who perform essential work. So again, there's two things here. You can do your own employees for premium pay or provide grants to eligible employers. And I think one of the challenging parts about this section is that it has a lot of definitions involved in it. We'll go over at least what those definitions, which words are defined, so that you can take a look at that and make sure that people who are getting premium pay or eligible employers meet those definitions under the ARPA. And then costs incurred for governmental services, which of course is limited to the revenue reduction calculation. We are working on coming up with a plan for that calculation. But the biggest challenge, I think one of the biggest challenges is figuring out what is included in general revenue. And we'll have a slide on that here too shortly. And then costs incurred to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband projects. The key there is going to make sure that the projects that you're choosing are eligible projects. And we'll talk about that too. Now, before I get to those slides, that's a little bit out of order. I'm sorry about that. But let's go over some questions that you've been asking us that we now have answers to. The first one is related to interest. So we sent out a Board of Accounts memorandum on June 15th of 2021 addressing this question. It's been posted on our website and it was sent through the eGov delivery service. So if you did not get that memorandum, or you didn't get the materials for today through the eGov delivery service, then you will want to sign up for that because you'll be missing out on things. You can do that on our homepage. If you just go down below the banner section, unfortunately it's in small words, but it says to subscribe to our service, click here. And you can fill out that information. So, but we did send out that memorandum, and it addressed a couple of questions. One is, can the ARPA money be placed in an interest-bearing account? And our position on that is yes, it can. There is no prohibition against you putting it in a interest-bearing account. The U.S. Treasury is not requiring you to remit the interest to them. So you're going to want to post your interest earned to the ARPA fund and keep track of it there. One thing we're not sure about is how you can use that interest. We don't know if it's considered program income to where it has to be used for the uses stated in the Act, or if it's interest or money that you can use for other purposes. So we do have a question into the U.S. Treasury about that. So for now, post it to the ARPA fund, and then we'll let you know when we get an answer to that. And then the other question was, can the ARPA money be commingled with other city or town money on deposit? And the answer to that is yes, it can. You're not required to keep it in a separate bank account. So if you do that, then you'll just have to calculate and identify the interest earned with that money. Okay, timing of costs incurred. I wanted to go through a few of these that have been answered by the U.S. Treasury now. And I think you already know this, but may funds be used to reimburse recipients for costs incurred by local governments in responding to the public health emergency and its negative economic impacts prior to the passage of the plan. And the interim final rule in the frequently asked questions is pretty clear that the use of the fiscal recovery funds is forward-looking, and it permits the funds to be used to cover costs incurred by the recipients beginning on March 3rd of 2021. Another timing of the costs: may construction on eligible water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure projects continue past December 31, 2024, assuming funds have been obligated prior to that date. And yes, if your costs have been obligated by December 31 of 2024, then the period of performance will run through December 31st of 2026. May recipients provide premium pay retroactively for work already performed? The Treasury says yes on that. Encourages recipients to consider providing premium pay retroactively for work performed during the pandemic. Okay, and on this one, do restrictions on using the Corona local fiscal recovery funds to cover costs beginning on March 3rd apply to costs incurred by the recipient or to costs incurred by households, businesses, and individuals benefiting from assistance provided using the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds? And the frequently asked questions discusses the interim final rule here, and it says that it permits funds to be used to cover costs incurred beginning on March 3rd, but this limitation applies to costs incurred by the recipient or your city or town. However, recipients may use the money to provide assistance to households, businesses, and individuals within the eligible use categories for economic harms experienced prior to March 3rd of 2021. So if this is something you're thinking about, you might want to pull out this frequently asked question or that portion of the interim final rule and take a look at that. Also on the next slide with record keeping, what records must be kept by governments receiving funds. You'll need to keep, I know we talked about this, your financial records, any supporting documentation for your expenses, as well as your assessments and explanations that you have for the funds. These all have to be kept for 5 years after all of the funds have been expended. And then we have the reporting requirements. I know you've seen this slide before, but I just wanted to remind you that some dates are coming up. For metropolitan cities, the interim report due date is August 31st. And then there's a quarterly project and expenditure report due October 31st. If you are a non-entitlement unit, city or town, then you have an annual project expenditure report due October 31st of 2021. As far as I know, we have not seen any information on what's going to be required in these reports other than what's stated in the interim final rule. So hopefully some more information will be forthcoming on that. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit more about those 4 categories for a few minutes. Remember that first category was responding to the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. And there's an assessment process that you're going to have to go through, or your city and town is going to have to go through when considering how to use these funds. And the first thing is identifying a need or negative economic impact due to COVID-19. For example, a need might be maybe there's not very many people vaccinated in your city or town. So that would be a need for a vaccination program maybe. Or maybe you've had a disproportionate number of people that have suffered economically for financial hardships due to COVID-19. That would be maybe a negative economic impact that you could identify. And then you're going to need to assess the connection between that need or the negative economic impact and COVID-19. Is there some kind of causal connection related to that? And for example, and then you're going to assess whether your responses, the response that you intend to do, whether that's reasonably proportional to the need or that economic harm. And then assess how or the extent to which the costs incurred would respond to that need. And then you need to document your assessments, your explanations and agreements with recipients. Make sure that documentation is available. And the interim final rule discusses this in more detail as to the assessments that you need to make. But just make sure that you do get those documented in that first category. A premium pay. Again, I mentioned earlier that this is a very definition-heavy section. So if your city or town is going to offer premium pay or grants to eligible employers, then you're going to want to make sure that you know all of the definitions. So for premium pay, those are the definitions listed there. Premium pay, eligible worker, essential work, and essential critical infrastructure sectors is also, there's examples of that in the interim final rule. So make sure you do take a look at that. There are a couple of things that you'll need to be aware of. You cannot pay, well, you can, but if you pay a worker above 150% of the greater of the state or county average annual wage, then you're going to have to justify that in writing to show how that premium pay responds to these workers. You can't pay more than $25,000 to an eligible worker. And just make sure that you maintain documentation and explanation that your premium pay meets the definitions and requirements of the ARPA and the interim final rule. On the next slide for general revenue, this is what I said might be a challenge for figuring out the reduction in revenue. You have to make sure you know what general revenue is per the calculation that you have to do. There is a formula that's in the interim final rule to use. And as you're analyzing your general revenue, the Treasury has pointed you toward the Census Bureau's annual survey of state and local government finances, which we have a link to there. There is a section on general revenue. And then the interim final rule then also talks about within that Census Bureau publication what they consider to be included and excluded for purposes of the Act. So it's not just as simple as taking your total receipts and for 2020 and comparing them to 2019. You're actually going to have to go through and do some analysis of your receipts. You can include taxes, current charges, miscellaneous general revenue, intergovernmental transfers between state and local governments. Those are all to be included, but there are several items that will need to be excluded, and that would be refunds or a correcting transaction, proceeds of debt, proceeds from the sale of investments, revenue generated by utilities, intergovernmental transfers from the federal government, including the transfers from the Coronavirus Relief Fund and the local fiscal recovery funds. So all of these things will need to be backed out. And that's, I mentioned earlier, we were working on trying to figure out the best way to do this and provide some guidance for you on that. But you will want to, of course, maintain documentation, explanation, and your calculations related to that. Now, also in a relationship to government services on the next slide, that's something too that you need. Oh, I missed one. Sorry. As far as general revenue, there are a few other things that you'll need to think about. Revenue is calculated on an entity-wide basis rather than a source-by-source basis. There is a time period for estimating revenue loss. You're supposed to calculate this based on 4 points in time, all related back to 2019, but it'll be December 31st of 2020, December 31st of 2021, 22, and 23. That would be your time period. The Act says that the reduction in revenue must be due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, and there was some questions on, well, how do we, know that for sure? But the interim final rule has said that if you follow their calculation, then it will be deemed a reduction in revenue due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. The U.S. Treasury has said that you do not have to use audited information. Of course, you would want to if you can, but if you don't have audited information, then you can use that as long as it is complete and it's accurate. The source of revenue data would be from your own records. It does not have to be from the Census Bureau statistics. You can do this on a cash or an accrual basis, however your records are. You just need to make sure you're consistent from year to year. I would imagine most of you would stay on a cash basis. And then the interim final rule does contain a formula for you to use in calculating the reduction in revenue. Now, once you do that, that amount you can use for government services, but it can't just be for anything. It has to be for something that will directly provide services to your citizens. And the final rule goes through a list of things that it could include. Again, these are this is not an exhaustive list, so you may have other items that are similar. But it can include like maintenance of infrastructure, including roads, modernization of cybersecurity, hardware, software, protection of infrastructure related to health services or environmental remediation, or the provision of police, fire, or other public safety services. That's the types of things that are discussed in the interim final rule. Now, there are some things that are specifically you cannot use it for under this section. Because, as the interim final rule says, it does not provide a direct service to your citizens. So that's kind of the key phrase there. Paying interest or principal on outstanding debt, paying interest on short-term revenue or tax anticipation warrants, paying fees or issuance costs associated with debt, replenishing your rainy day fund or any other reserve fund, cannot be used for pension deposits or non-federal match. So you do need to keep those in mind as you're considering what you want to spend that money on in the category of government services. And then that last category was investments in water, sewer, and broadband. In order to see whether your water or sewer project would be eligible under the ARPA, you'll want to reference either the Clean Water or Drinking Water publications there. Those do have eligible projects in those, and your project under the ARPA would need to be aligned with those projects. For broadband, it is required to be for unserved or underserved areas, and there are expected speeds related to broadband service. So you're going to want to take a look at the interim final rule and the frequently asked questions, which are in section 6, I think, related to broadband, for more information on that. So with that, I think we can just open it up for questions now, either on the ARPA or legislation or any other thing that you would like to talk about today.